Thanks, everyone. Look, I'm actually going to be preaching to the choir today, so I was sort of hoping there might have been a few more people outside of our usual group. But look, so I'll just share today probably a few of the challenges that are facing the not only the forest growing, local producing sectors, but also those who specify, use and want good quality timber materials or wood materials for building and construction. And part of the question is, where is the wood going to come from? You've probably all heard the statement that apparently is correct, that the demand for timber over the next 50 years is expected to grow fourfold. And you look at timber supply globally, there really just isn't enough wood to satisfy that demand. Not if we're going to do it sustainably, and more importantly, sustainably into the long term with long-term reliable supply. So I'll just touch on a few challenges faced by Australia, a little bit of where our wood is coming from at the moment, but more importantly, if things were to change and what the opportunities are with some potential innovative products, and some of these products have been around for a long time, we've just never used them, that could fit within that circular economy framework. And by the way, small group, just jump in any time, ask questions. So most of you probably know my background. I work for Responsible Wood. We're one of the 4 accredited standards development organisations. We write the Australian standards for sustainable forest management and chain of custody, and we represent PEFC in Australia and New Zealand. My own personal background, next year I've been in the forest products sector for 40 years. Which scares the crap out of me because I wasn't 2 when I started, so I must be turning into a middle-aged man, and I don't know where all those years have gone. The first 30 years of that I spent in the veneer and plywood engineered wood product sector, and basically taking trees and big lumps of wood, breaking them down, and using glue, heat and pressure, turning little bits of wood into bigger bits of wood. I still chair the Australian Standards Committee for Engineered Wood Products, so I've got a fairly strong background in that area. And a lot of the opportunities, especially when it comes to the circular economy, really does involve different forms of engineered wood products. But just as a starting statement, and we're all familiar with this, why does sustainable forestry matter? You go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and a very well-known statement, which is absolutely factual. In the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fibre or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit. And basically what the IPC is saying is that, good forestry, sustainable forestry is probably our best bet, at least in the short term, to mitigate climate change. And we all know that if we can substitute steel for timber, or if we can just grow more forests, or if we can manage our forests to increase the carbon content of the forest, whether that's soil carbon or carbon locked away in wood, people ask me, well, what is wood? Wood is basically carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. So it is by far and obviously the best bet for climate change. Okay, and we've all familiar with large, really attractive, mass timber buildings, even architectural applications. Using wood is actually a pretty good thing. Here's a couple more photos. Left-hand side is the airport at Nelson in New Zealand. Right-hand side is the Scion building at Rotorua. That was the winner of the World Architectural Festival Sustainable Timber Award, and I think in about 2022. And what I love, you look at the roof, it means absolutely nothing to anybody. You think, well, they're nice architectural features. It is actually the genetic code of radiata pine embossed on the ceiling. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's quite amazing.
Does it break the sound too, Simon?
Look, it probably does. It's a pretty big building, so I was there a couple of weeks ago, and you're not getting echoes. So it's probably has multiple features.
There you go, multifunctional.
Absolutely, but it looks pretty. It's also designed in a high earthquake area. Again, timber, as you know, is ductile. It's a great material in areas where you do get rather large earthquakes. Okay, so
storing a lot of carbon.
Storing an awful lot of carbon, which is what we want. Okay, so where does our wood come from at the moment? And as I said, I'm preaching to the choir. We all know this. But in Australia, our wood supply predominantly is plantation. It is predominantly, short rotation, exotic pines, whether that's radiata pine, Caribbean pine, different hybrids. There is a little bit of native pine, or it's not actually pine, it's an Araucaria hoop pine grown in Queensland, but predominantly exotics, predominantly with a rotation age. Now, rotation age is the time from when you plant the tree to when you cut it down, of 25 to about 28 years. The next source of timber is fast grown, native species in plantations, usually grown for pulp and paper. There is a bit of, I would say, a bit of a trend to grow some of these plantations longer and starting to produce some sawwood, but for a whole range of reasons, mostly to do with wood quality and economics, those options are somewhat restricted. But you never know. Going into the future, there could be some new options open up. And the top one is native forest, and we're all familiar with native forest. It's the natural grown estate that we have in Australia, managed oftentimes for multiple purposes, which includes recreation, environmental protection, as well as for timber supply. And to put some numbers on it, Australia's got about 134 million hectares of forest. 132 million hectares of that is native forest. And of that, there's 46 million, which is exclusively for conservation. So that's national parks, those type of things. And there's about 28 million hectares of native forest that's available and suitable for harvesting. This number is a little bit out of date. So we've got, Victoria and Western Australia that have transitioned out of native forest. That I think the total area is about 6 million hectares. So we can probably add another 6 million hectares to the conservation estate. And we've got about 1.65 million hectares of plantation forest. And a rough breakdown, about 1 million of those is pine, and about 650,000 hectares is fast-grown native species in plantations. And Alistair, hopefully got those numbers about right. You're the expert.
No, like you said, I mean, I think that they're the figures that have last been published by the federal government, so they'll be updating those, I'd imagine, in the next sort of round that come out.
Absolutely.
Just with you, when you mentioned the 650,000, you mentioned sort of native plantations. I suppose they're sort of specific hardwood plantations in a sense for, a lot of it being globulus and stuff for pulp, which hopefully will actually be able to redirect into engineered wood products. So that's
one of the options going into the future.
When you say fast grown, you said that 650,000 is fast grown. Is it actually for engineered timber members like columns and beams, or is it more other product?
Yeah, that's one of the problems, Stephen. With our hardwood forests, we don't normally harvest them until about sort of 80 years or more.
Yeah.
Sort of typically with our native forests. That's why it's always been difficult to get, people to transition out of native forests into plantations, because who's going to invest in a plantation they don't see a return in their lifetime? So unless you can get carbon credits around it, then it's just not been worthwhile people doing it. Having said that, there have been a number of people that have invested in plantations, and a lot of the genetics has been looking about how you can grow some of these species perhaps a little bit quicker to harvest them a bit quicker. But what's, I suppose, that the key to it's been this sort of interest in engineered wood products. So, globulus, by example, which is what the blue gum everyone stuck in for the pulp sector, and then that sort of market fell over. It's no good for appearance products, and it's not a very good structural product in its sawn form. But if you actually veneer globulus and glue it back together like an LVL, you actually get quite a strong product. So what we're trying to do now is to encourage investment in the sector to actually do that work. That the technology's there and the understanding's there. It's just about getting people to invest to redirect that fibre into a better resource. So it does mean you can use thinnings, in the normal life of the plantation, or you can perhaps harvest at 14 or 15 years. So, a third of the time it would normally take you to grow a native forest. So some really interesting engineered wood product stuff happening.
Oh, look, absolutely. And, there's definite opportunity there. And one of the real challenges is at the moment, the market for those products is the international pulpwood market. It's cyclic. And right at the moment, I would say that every hardwood plantation owner supplying pulp or pulpwood or chip into international markets is, if they're lucky, they're breaking even. So it's, the prices and Australia's competitiveness right at the moment is not particularly good. So how big is the forest industry? So about 52,000 Australians are directly employed. And there's a multiplier of, somewhere between, 2 to 3 or 4, depending upon the community on that. So there's a lot of associated jobs as well. About 23 billion in economic turnover, 0.5% of GDP. So we're not a huge industry, but at the same time, we're still pretty significant. And exported about $3.3 billion in exports. Now that is, as I said before, predominantly chip and pulp, and again, predominantly from plantation forests.
So it's probably useful to say that a lot of that economic activity is in regional areas too. So it's where it happens is important. It's just as important to how much it is.
Oh, look, and a lot of the regional communities, really the only good term secure jobs really are in forestry as well.
And the imports, I think during COVID we hit almost $4 billion trade, deficit. It's going to level back down to about $2 billion, but we import far more than we export, showing that there's a net, need in Australia for timber products.
Oh, look, absolutely. And then the question is, where does the wood come from? And that is the $65 million question. So look, just, native harvesting, there's this perception, and I don't know where it comes from, that in native forests, we cut it all down and that's the end of it and the forest is gone forever. Under Australian law, everything that's harvested has to be regenerated. Now, here's just a photo of the same location over the course of about 4 years. About 6 months after harvest, I think 12 months, 2 years and 4 years. You see the final photo there, bottom right-hand side, the forest is starting to regenerate. That will be left for another, 55 to maybe even 75 years. And during that time, it's storing carbon. It's supporting biodiversity, as well as providing sustainably sourced wood products. Okay, a little bit on forest certification. So that's my day job. Now, just a little bit of an alarming statistic. So this is a graph over the last few years of the area that's got credible, sustainable forest management that's audited and verified. You see there's quite a large reduction. That's mostly due to the Russia being suspended by both PFC and FSC. So again, the availability of certified wood, look, it's interesting. Russia supplied about 30% of global wood production, which is huge. You can't take out 30% of global wood production without some sort of ramification. Interesting enough, the amount of certified wood doesn't seem to have reduced by that much. And without making any suggestions, allegations, there's a few questionable supply chains. And that's probably about as much as I can say without getting sued. But regardless, the area of well-managed, verified, certified forest, has declined. More importantly, it's been stable at about 10 to 11 or 12% of global forests, probably for close to a decade. All of the low-hanging fruit, all of the well-managed forests in developed countries is now certified, which really does leave 90% of global forests where, I wouldn't say, some of the non-certified forests are very, very well managed. Regrettably, a lot of them aren't. And as I said before, with the fourfold increase in wood demand over the next 50 years, it's almost certain that some of those areas will come under increasing pressure.
So Simon, why do you think it is that it's remained stable now at around 11%?
Look, 10-11%? And it's predominantly in developed countries and countries with really good forest regulations which are enforced. So the forests which are easily certified, they've all been certified, which leaves places like Papua New Guinea, Solomons, where there's a thimbleful of certified forests, but the vast majority aren't. Almost all of the African timber-producing areas and large parts of South America. And that is probably where the risks are. And, to be fair, if I was a concession holder in Brazil and I wanted to get certified, which meant that my wood volumes decreased by 80% to a sustainable level, the economics around that are pretty challenging. And when you don't have strong regulations to back it up, so it's one thing that globally both the timber sector that participates in the in good forestry, environmental groups and consumers need to get on the same bandwagon and say, hey, these sort of activities have to stop. It's quite interesting. You've probably seen you'll be aware of the European deforestation regulations, and the Europeans have this initiative to try to stamp out some of these practices. The really interesting thing is the amount of pushback, and sometimes for some good reasons. But, for example, the Chinese came out this week saying that they're not going to participate because it's a security issue to tell the Europeans where they're procuring their wood from. And China supplies 50% of packaging into Europe and about 70% of furniture. So where that all lands, I don't know. Look, I think the good news is that Australia as a country, despite some of the things that allegations which are made, 95% of our production forests are certified. We do have very, very strong forest law. If you do something wrong, somebody somewhere is going to see it, and there'll be something in place to stop it happening. So as a country, 95% with a global average of about 11%. So we do really punch above our weight.
That is our frustration, as all on the call would know here in Victoria now, with the shutting down of a sustainable native forest sector, and the hardwood consumer demand hasn't dropped. So for durable species, that's all now coming from a tropical rainforest somewhere, as you said, New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Philippines, places like that just don't have certification. So it's a real sort of political frustration that, sort of sold as a good environmental decision is a really bad environmental outcome. Yeah, it's just frustrating.
Well, absolutely. I would say in the last probably 2 months, I'm getting 2 to 3 calls a week from merchants who are asking me about, I'm going to import some, a particular species out of South America or out of China, but I expect the wood's probably come from Papua New Guinea. Is it sustainable? And it's not certified. And the thing is, you just don't know. I'd say a lot of the materials from some of those countries, probably definitely put them on the naughty list. But there's nothing. You've got the illegal logging legislation in Australia. If it's legal in the country of harvest, but you can go to Papua New Guinea and get a permit to clear fell 100,000 hectares of virgin rainforest. Completely legal. Well, it was actually. They've changed those laws recently, but until last year it was. Definitely not sustainable and not something that I don't think we'd want to be participating in, directly or indirectly. Okay, sorry about that. We got a little bit off track, but it's all interesting. Got plenty of time though. Okay, a little bit on the circular economy. Now, I'll start with the situation with Australian timber supply. So have you look at the graph. You've got the two bars. You've got the orange bar, which is the size of the softwood plantation estate. And you look at the darker, or sort of a reddy dark brown colour, which is the size of the hardwood plantation estate. Now, who can tell me what's happening there? It's dropping rapidly. So,
massive decline. Yeah, massive decline. Yeah,
absolutely. So people will say, "Oh, look, let's get out of native forests and let's just grow more plantations." Not that easy. The hardwood plantation estate, which is the obvious substitute for some of the native species, is dropping rapidly. There's a whole heap of reasons for that. One is that, legacy of the managed investment schemes in the early 2000s, where financial advisors or, were basically making forestry decisions, big tax incentives to put in plantations. So wrong trees in the wrong place and the wrong species. It's some of that. Also just some of the economics around expanding the plantation estate. So I was, this is actually, I'm just sort of written it down. So I'm a farmer. I think, okay, I want to diversify my income by putting some plantation on my property. So he'll go to the bank and he'll say, look, Mr. Banker, can I borrow $1 million to invest in 300 hectares of plantations? And the bank said, well, that sounds interesting. Come and talk to us. And the first thing the banker will say was, what's your return on investment? And the farmer's going to say, well, I invest $1 million. The return is going to be $12 million. So the banker will say, well, let's go and pull out the paperwork. And then he says, is that over 5 years? You say, well, no, that's in 60 years. And all of a sudden it's become a little bit less attractive. And he says, 60 years, you've got outgoings during those 60 years? They go, well, yes, of course I do. And then the banker will say, well, what are the risks? He says, well, over 60 years, I've got an 80% probability of my plantation being destroyed by fire, which is not good, which is factual. And then he say, well, how do you mitigate the risk? And then the farmer says, well, actually, I can't get insurance because there's not a single insurance company in Australia that insures plantation forestry. So you sort of get the message there. It's, easy to say, let's put in more plantations, but there's an awful lot of barriers.
I guess a response to that, sorry, Simon, a response to that would actually be that even though agroforestry and plantations sort of investment by farmers is a good thing for a range of reasons for their farms, if you look back on all the plantations in Australia, when you've done big tracts of this, it's always been done by government. Well, the government is the only one that's got capacity to actually do it. And the thing what government does, it has sort of access to either a lot of land, which is really what happened in Victoria, or a lot of money, or both, because you need, if you have to buy the land, someone's got to pay for it. And the price of land has almost doubled regionally since COVID. So the economics has changed. But the big risk for a plantation is probably its first 10 years. I mean, once the trees are established, they've got a certain sort of resistance then to fire that they don't have when they're young. So typically plantations in Australia and other parts of the world have generally been done on a broad scale with government investment, who then sell it off sort of 10, 15 years into the growth phase and make, a shitload of money into the sort of superannuation investment schemes that want to sort of have a long-term investment. So, yeah, I mean, look, farmers are a part of the solution, but if we're wanting to see sort of broad scale plantation investment, it's not going to come from that sector.
Look, and it's managing the risks. One of the fundamental challenges we have is that there is not a single insurance company in Australia now who will underwrite plantations.
Well, the difference with government is also they operate their own insurance schemes. Well, Victorian government has its own insurance schemes. Yeah, so it can sort of change that dynamic if they're the ones actually putting the risk in.
Absolutely, and you're right, Alistair. A lot pivots around government policy and also direct government participation. Now, even just in the softwood sector, I've got a little note down here. So, where I live in Brisbane, just to the north of Brisbane, there's extensive plantation estates. It was, the plantations were originally owned by the state government. They sold them off about 10 years ago. But the arrangement was that the plantation manager owns the trees, but the government still owns the land. They announced a couple of months ago that they're going to resume 3,500 hectares of plantation for new housing. That's enough wood for 2,500 homes a year. So again, we need to make up that shortfall as well. So, it's around the plantation sector, not everything's all that rosy and positive. Okay, this is the development of new plantations. So you see it's very, very little. It was larger, especially in the early 2000s, but right now it's very stable and quite small. Volumes of high quality hardwoods. Now, if you look at the plot there, there's an overall downwards trend. That trend will be accelerating with the shutdown of Victoria and Western Australia. So we still need those products though. There is really no reliable substitute for high quality, dense structural timber. That's environmentally positive. Okay, and if you look at the volumes, left-hand side, that's the volumes of harvested softwood, and right-hand side, the reduction in volumes in hardwood plantations. So you see in both cases, the amount of wood that's being harvested is decreasing. Interesting enough, probably the only plantations in Australia that are producing genuine high quality hardwood logs suitable for sawing is in northern New South Wales. Long story, but the plantations were established on agricultural land in the 60s and 70s by a paper company who had a paper mill in the area. The paper mill shut down in the 1980s. The plantations were sold on to the state government, who managed them for sawlog, and these are magnificent plantations, very well managed, exceptionally good wood quality, and it's a natural substitute for native forestry. Problem is that the local environmental groups are now coming out very, very strongly wanting the plantations protected. Partly because it's within the footprint of the northern New South Wales Great Koala National Park, and partly because they've been so well managed that unless you actually were in the right location and see the lineal rows, you really wouldn't even know that it wasn't that it was a planted forest, not a natural forest. So it's interesting. Challenges are all over the place. Even when you think you're doing the right thing, you run into some fairly strong opposition. So that particular forest is certified. I've got a complaints file that's 300 pages from different local stakeholders who are wanting the plantations put into conservation. Now, increase in imports. So this is, I think, 2003 data. So what's happening? We basically our plantation estate is not large enough. The amount of wood being harvested is reducing. The access to native forests are again being restricted. So what's happening? It means that imports make up the difference. So I think this is last year, there was 400,000 cubic metres of softwood framing imported. 15, 20 years ago, we were self-sufficient, or very close to being self-sufficient. We're no longer self-sufficient with softwood framing. And about 400,000 cubic metres of engineered wood products. I actually think that number might be a little bit low, but that's what was published. Where does the softwood come from? Mostly Europe, a little bit from New Zealand, a little bit from Canada, mostly Europe. And of the European material, probably 2/3 originated in Russia, probably from old growth forests. So again, not necessarily the best environmental outcome. Any questions on that one? Now, personally, I believe that Australia should be trying to be self-sufficient with timber supply. Timber is a strategic material.
So you said earlier you got 1 million, was it, hectares of softwood plantations?
1 million. Yep.
And what was it, 10 to 15? What was it, 10 to 15?
Sorry, we need about another 400,000.
Yeah, I was going to say, what was it 10 to 15 years ago when you said the sort of needle changed? Do you know?
Right, look, I think it's been
or supply is the issue.
Yeah, I think it's demand. So
demand,
housing starts have increased.
Yeah, 100%.
So so if the GDP grows by 2 or 3% a year, it means that our plantations should be growing at a similar sort of rate to be self-sufficient.
With economic trends all in sync, as we saw through COVID, and there's demand for timber that happens at the same time across all countries. Australia is a long way away from most larger markets, and we're almost a rounding error to a lot of exporters. As we saw, didn't get enough timber. Now we've got this huge housing hangover, which in part is due to that.
Yep. Right at the moment, I think things have changed a bit because housing starts are down a bit. I think we're probably a bit more self-sufficient than what we have been in the past, but there's still sizable imports of wood, especially in the engineered wood product space. But where will the wood come from? Well, the obvious thing is new plantations. That's good, but you're looking at 30 to 80 years. 80 years if you want a hardwood saw log. 30 years for a softwood log. Agroforestry, huge potential. So there's some fairly good, well, actually it's global research, but also replicated in Australia, that if you have 30% tree cover in agricultural land, and not only do you have timber production, but it also improves agricultural production. You've got leaves that fall and produce nutrients for the soil. You've got shade cover, which locks moisture in the ground, so you get better grass. You've got shelter for livestock. So, I think going forward, agroforestry will become increasingly important. It's got a lot of challenges. One of the main ones is that usually the agroforestry operations are a long, long way from a sawmill, and getting the economics to work can be challenging. Imports, well, that's what we've been doing. Is it sustainable? I don't know. And there's a lot of questionable sources. And as I said, going forward, there will be a global shortage of wood. New innovative products. So Alistair spoke about engineered wood products from our hardwood plantation resource. Absolutely. But again, that's probably a medium, maybe even a long-term option, but absolutely something there's a lot of work happening in this space. And I'll be really excited when I see someone actually starting to invest in it. There's also the circular economy. So I'll just talk about a few things in the circular economy that are happening right now that you may find interesting.
Just before you jump off new innovative wood products, Simon, there's also quite a lot of work at the moment with industry looking at its product it's got out there and the grades of it with the current resource. And there's certainly some interest in actually having a look to see if there might be ability to use some of the wood as a lower grade than currently our MGP10, and then that particularly things like wall studs and something like that, which is sort of fairly redundant in terms of the amount of sort of application in loads and houses. I think there'll definitely be a bit of a take up in some grade applications that can't currently be used over the next few years. I mean, that'll require a bit of discussion with industry, but there's quite a bit of interest in that at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. Carl had his hand up.
Yep.
Yes. Simon, quick question. Have you ever looked into urban logging? So I'm living in a very leafy suburb of Sydney, and the amount of tree loggers driving up and down the street is actually significant, and they're pulling down the most beautiful hardwood
absolutely.
trees.
Agreed.
And the really sad thing is, you look what they do with them. They normally have a massive chipper towed behind their truck, and it all just absolutely. It's a potential source of wood. I know of one tree lopper who is actually supplying, it's only small volumes, into a small, I think it's almost like a boutique sawmill somewhere in Melbourne, but he pops up occasionally.
There's actually quite a number of companies in Melbourne actually that do go around identifying trees that are going to be harvested, particularly for appearance and furniture and product, what do you call it, pots and things like that, for a little bit more of a unique boutique market. So it's not really going to give you any additional product into your structural market, I can imagine. But even up in up in the Dandenong, since they've had a lot of the problems with trees falling over in storms, there's some groups that have been set up actually coming in to assist homeowners to take trees down if they've actually fallen or they have threats of falling, and actually sort of use that for a good use, not just chip it. So yeah, definitely that circular economy discussions flowing through to the consumers and community as well about, how best do we use our natural resources. So that's a positive thing. We all should be encouraging that as we can.
Yeah, I would say, Alistair, I think we should be careful not call this circular economy, because it's still kind of in the harvesting process, right? So this is more addressing actually questions around where's the wood coming from.
Yeah.
It could be like design for deconstruction, Karl Heinz. When you plant a tree in your backyard, think about what you're going to do with that at the end of life.
Absolutely.
Chipper.
Well, no, not at all. Not a chipper at all. We're like, how can you actually use that? Particularly, there's a lot of good community groups setting up around that.
Yeah, I heard recently kind of an interesting interview from people in Greater London, which kind of driving the conversation even in places like London, looking into urban logging and making sure actually the material is not being chipped, so the material finds a better use, because always it finds a use, it then increases obviously the opportunity for materials being really specifically used in where they're at their best. And Stephen, you on the call as well, you may, once you're on your push bike up in Terry Hills, there's hidden away a little sawmill just trying to get into that space.
That's funny.
It's actually something where we should do a bit of kind of investigation. So how many trees coming down in Greater Sydney, in Greater Melbourne, in Greater Brisbane every single day?
Yeah, absolutely.
Will be a shocking number.
I live in a similar area to Karl. I live in a very leafy part of north side Sydney as well, and it's just phenomenal, guys, the way that redevelopment of housing is occurring. They're putting bigger houses on lots that had beautiful trees everywhere. They're getting chopped down. They're not getting recycled for a better term of use. They are, and I rode past one this morning, Karl. There's a chipper out the front of a place, and there are guys just willy-nilly throwing it into the back of the chipper. Yep. It's a crime.
Absolutely.
I can't remember what country it is, Gavin or Kevin, you might recall, but I think it's somewhere in Europe. It could be Sweden or somewhere, where they actually barcode a lot of trees in the backyards of homes, sort of recognising at some point they're actually going to come and harvest those and have a use for them. So having a sort of proper management database system that identifies these things in the future. And look, it's a similar sort of thought in terms of, wood and where it might come from at the moment. And we've been chatting to the government about this down in Victoria here about mandating around sort of home demolition. So particularly in sort of residential buildings, like sort of pre 1980. I mean, every house in Victoria would have been built out of green hardwood. So I mean, all of that hardwood is now sort of well and truly seasoned and is sort of sitting in there in the home. At the moment, when somebody comes and demolishes a home, like you guys said before, you drive past it in the morning, you come back in the afternoon and the total block's cleared. The house is gone, the trees are gone, everything's gone. It's just dirt, which is just absolutely wrong. They should be keeping some of the vegetation, but definitely they should also be deconstructing the homes now. But all of that hardwood framing would absolutely have a market into the furniture sector now that we no longer have a accessible public resource. It just requires some level of government sort of mandating that you got to do it, like force people to do the right thing. I mean, it's just got to happen.
Oh, look, I can tell you my own personal story. So our last house that we lived in for 20 years, it was on a 1,200 square metre block. When we sold it, it was bought by a developer. We had 4 massive scribbly gums in the backyard, and we're living in a koala area. One day we had 8 koalas in those trees. at one stage, one of our neighbours went nuts over one of the trees, wanted me to cut it down. So I approached the council and they just said, no, it's a protected tree. Can't cut it down. You can apply to get a permit. The application is $2,000. So the tree sat there and, the neighbour, I had to deal with the neighbour. But the developer came along, those 4 trees disappeared on day one, just disappeared. And then the house that we had was built in the mid-60s, timber framed, beautiful polished timber floors, the whole lot just chucked in the back of a truck and gone forever, which is absolute waste.
Yeah, sacrilege. Monica?
Hi all, some great conversation we're happening here. And it would be great to put this on our resources page on MECLA so that we have access to it on demand. So I think there are a few ways, coming back to the issue around circularity. If there was so we're talking to the EPA at the moment, New South Wales EPA, around having a nutcracker, a workshop on circular materials and how do we actually reduce 40% of the waste that goes into landfill is from building materials. How do we actually address this? And what's the regulatory framework that would need to be put in place to make sure that we do create a more circular economy? So that's one opportunity for us to input into that. The other is, of course, the federal governments. They've got their framework on circular economy out for consultation at the moment, and we've got a meeting with them next week. And this would also be one that I continue to raise and kind of create what's the regulatory framework for making this a requirement. So that's on the going to landfill. I guess it's a more complex with when we're talking about removing trees in our urban environment and what we need to be able to do about that. So I'd be interested in what specific rules and regulations you think would be really useful there. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Ralph?
It seems to me that there's an opportunity here in terms of thinking about circular economy approaches. There are some things happening, technologies that need to be leveraged. And if I think about some of the things that you've spoken about, demolition of existing houses and the like, there's certainly a market here in Adelaide where bricks get recycled, roof tiles get recycled. There are businesses that come along, take those things away and retail them and sell them into the renovation extension market, those sorts of things where it's important for people to match existing. One thing that always rings true to me is it's very hard to make a piece of timber longer, but it's quite a bit easier to make it shorter. It would seem to me that if there was a business that was harvesting these buildings that are being demolished, there would be a standard range of materials that would quickly become available. When I'm thinking F-grade radiata and MGP radiata, from the 70s and 80s in those houses, which are now starting to be end of life and demolished. And if there was some way to catalogue larger, glulam elements, native timbers that come out of those buildings as a resource for designers that we had access to, and you had some way of being able to put those members aside, then you could start to do some serious damage in terms of reusing harvested materials as opposed to buying new off the shelf. And the other technology that's interesting in this space, where there was some presentations at WCTE last year, is around the use of parametrics. And the one that sticks in my mind is, I think there was a tower in Switzerland which has become irrelevant due to land uses surrounding, and they actually did an exercise where they had parametrics help them design a new tower of a different architectural design, which used the elements from the tower which was to be demolished. And optimized for the members and the grades and the lengths that were available. So I think in terms of circular economy approaches, there are a number of areas that can be targeted, and we can wait for governments to have some force and influence in that space. But wouldn't it be lovely if there was a commercial imperative and someone could actually make $1 out of setting up to do that kind of process.
Exactly.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, in the construction industry where I operate a lot of the time, there are big operators in that field that will recycle concrete, right? They'll recycle steel, they'll separate the steel, and it goes to reason with residential. Why can't we do the same? Yes, it'll take a little bit longer, but why can't we, to your point, as well as Monica's, do precisely the same and, you know, harvest some of these more rare timbers from mid-60s homes like I live in?
Definitely.
Gavin?
Yeah, look, I agree with all that. Can I revisit a bit earlier? One of the areas that to get more fibre, we've got 1 million hectares of softwood plantation. If we do things better, new genetics, a whole bunch of different things like that, even 3, 4, 5%, that's a lot of fibre potentially coming back in as well. So not just new plantations, but actually improving what we do with the ones we have, let alone bringing in hardwood plantations and new products. But also one of the things we're doing, I think we're doing a really good job of not only building our houses, traditional timber frames, but also moving timber products into new uses. So that pie is just getting bigger and bigger as well. So there's going to be more and more challenges to meet it. So a couple of things there.
Anyhow, I better keep on going. We're getting a bit short on time. So anyhow, so going back to the circular economy, the amount of wood going into landfill, it's 1,825,000 tonnes. I actually think that's a bit of an underestimation, but that's 3 million cubic metres, which is an awful lot of wood.
Sorry, mate, is that annually? What is that?
That is annually. So there's roughly 3 million tonnes of wood or wood waste going into landfill a year.
Ridiculous.
We import 800,000 cubic metres roughly. So could we, in theory, in a perfect world, mobilise only 25% of our waste products and develop a range of circular economy products? Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples that you might find interesting. What's already been done? So particle board manufacturers. Particle board is an absolute bottom feeder. You can put absolute crappy wood into particle board and make an incredibly good product. Company called D&R Henderson, one of Gavin's members, about 20% of their wood is post-consumer. So they've got a product stewardship program where they recover wood waste from truss and frame, from cabinet makers. They're even getting a little bit of demolition waste. Now, they had to invest pretty heavily in washing and cleaning of the wood fibre because that was one of their major challenges. And the really interesting thing, when they first started this process, they had an unforeseen benefit in that they were recovering brass and some of the more expensive metals from old kitchen furniture and those type of things. And they were making about $2,000 a month on scrap brass as old kitchen cabinets got chopped up and the metal separated. Another company called Borg, they're doing something similar. So in the particle board space, much of the particle board made in Australia already has, quite a sizable recycled content. It'd be good maybe if they'd publish some of that and start making some claims. I think there's value in that. Recycling of large timber structures, we're all familiar with that. Bridges, pylons. As we've sort of discussed, it's a shame this doesn't really, come down to the residential house level. But there is some amazing high quality timber in some of this, and some of the old railway transoms and products like that. But what we really need, Alistair and Gavin, you may be around long enough to, we say in the timber industry, don't mention the S word. The S word was a product called Scrimba. Okay, what was Scrimba? It was a right-hand side there. You see, it's an engineered glued product made from scrims of timber. Like a scrim is it's like a toothpick, only it's probably 10 centimetres long and 2 or 3 centimetres wide, called a scrim. And you'd basically either get waste materials or forest thinnings or forest waste. You scrim it, and then you can make this product called Scrimba. The intellectual property was developed in Australia by CSIRO. There was a pilot plant that went in Mount Gambier. They didn't quite have the technology right, and it turned out to be a complete disaster. The politicians threw their hands up and pulled their funding, and so they sold the intellectual property to Georgia Pacific in the US for 1 cent in the dollar, and now GP is providing scrimba all over the world. But what this would allow you to do is to take the wood waste going into landfill. You'd have to divert it at the landfill. You would put it through a process where you make scrims and you glue it back together in a product called scrimba. The technology is proven. It's being done in other parts of the world. Where there's challenges is around the building codes and AS 1720, which is the timber engineering standard. It will have different properties to solid wood. It's probably not quite as stiff or strong. What it means is you just use a slightly bigger bit and it'll still be entirely fit for purpose.
Was it mainly for housing, framing, Simon? What was it used for?
It would be a direct substitute for pine framing. As I said, you might need to use a bigger bit, but the National Construction Code is going to a larger framing size to get additional insulation in domestic housing anyhow. So there'll probably be a natural fit there. And you can even make scrimba from garden wastes. So I just sort of see this scenario where, if you've got a really big landfill site that's getting lots of, recovered wood waste plus garden waste, you can blend it all together, chip it up, scrim it, and make scrimba out of those sort of materials. Just in theory. Now, no one's investing in it. I don't think it's even on anyone's radar, but at a technical level, we could very easily utilise a lot of that wood waste and make a product like this. Another really interesting
rubber.
Simon, just before you leave that, there was a question around, can you scrimba again? And my feeling is that you could.
You could, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you could, and but how many times after that? But we're already talking, if it's in a house, you're talking 50 to 100 years anyway, so it's way beyond our lifetimes.
Look, what I would say is you probably wouldn't re-scrim scrimba for scrimba, but you'd probably put it into particle board. Where the length of the fibres is not such an issue. So there's another circular economy home for it. Another little project.
Simon, just before we leave this, in a past life, I did a lot of work with the pulp and paper industry, and I see a lot of parallels with the circular economy with what the pulp and paper industry did with cardboard and those kind of things as well. So something that was a waste product coming out of the back of supermarkets, etc., became a very is a very popular and expensive product, to be honest.
Absolutely.
The cleaner the waste stream is, the better. But certainly when things become a bit scarcer, people start to use a bit more of it. So the way a collection, so redirect recycling, is kind of mirroring what happened with the pulp and paper industry probably 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I can see us traveling that direction for a whole bunch of different waste. Well, I'm not even going to call them waste products, end-of-life products.
And absolutely. Products from recovered materials. And look, another really, really interesting little project. Now, I'll blow my own trumpet here. I'm the initiator of this. I had the Tyre Stewardship Council approach me for completely other reasons, and we were discussing recycling of rubber, which is, PFC has a rubber program. And I said, look, have you ever spoken to the timber industry and combining rubber into particle board? And they said, no, we've never thought of it. So I put them in contact with a research provider, and somebody found about 300 grand to do a research project. So what's been done is they've taken recycled rubber from tyres, shredded tyres, blended it with wood fibre and made particle board out of it, up to 30% recycled rubber content. But what does it actually mean? So particle board in Australia is loaded up with waxes and resins to improve the thickness swell. Most particle board goes into kitchen and bathroom furniture. If it will get a bit of moisture, and if it swells, it creates all sorts of issues. But waxes and resins are expensive. They're also a petrochemical product. But anyhow, by combining the rubber content, it actually improved the thickness swell. It actually did a better job reducing thickness swell than what the waxes and resins actually did. It greatly improved the water resistance. It has much better screw holding properties. Again, when you're putting doors on your kitchen cupboards, you want those screws to be held particularly well. It's not quite as stiff because again, rubber is quite ductile. Stiffness is not such an issue for kitchen and bathroom furniture. What would be really interesting to see what an EPD would look like. So, in theory,
are those images different ratios of rubber? Is that what that is?
They're different ratios of rubber, and also those samples have gone through a stiffness test, so they've already been bent to work out how stiff and strong they are. So that's why they're not perfectly straight.
Yeah.
The really interesting thing is that about 20 to 30% rubber, you got some really incredible properties. If we were to combine 20 or 30% waste tyre material into particle board, we would have to import waste tyres because we don't have enough. So
who's done this, Simon?
It's been done by the research has been done by QDAF, Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. So they've got a research lab in Brisbane. So they've made a whole heap of different trial products. Next stage, and I don't know if we'll get to, it'd be nice if we did, is actually do a pilot study. Now the rubber crumb will be completely compatible with existing processing equipment.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is just blend in the crumb. It sands well. There's no problems burning the waste materials to generate energy. So it sort of ticks every box. One of the issues though is obviously cost. Rubber crumb costs a certain amount, waxes and resins cost a certain amount, and no one's looked at the economics of it yet. But what I would say, if you were a particle board manufacturer and you set up a little operation to receive waste tyres, you get paid to take the tyres. So that actually don't cost you anything, and whatever the conversion costs are would probably be similar to taking a log and turning it into particle board or particles anyhow. So it might work out. Next little piece of work they're doing is looking at EPDs and just seeing how an EPD for this sort of product would look. But again, really, really exciting.
Really interesting. Just a question in the chat from everyone here from Monica was about the Scrimba, I think it was. Which state government could invest in this if the business case was made? And obvious reasons, because landfill's becoming, more and more expensive, and not the place to throw it, right?
Look, where I would see Scrimba, if you wanted to use recovered wood waste, I would just find the biggest landfill in the country. You would need to make it work, you'd need about 50,000 tonnes of wood waste, but then you can also supplement it with garden waste. And depending upon how old the landfill is, you could even tap the underground methane coming out of the landfill for running your boiler. So it could be interesting.
Very.
So look, it's feasible, but again, whether you get a private sector investor, I doubt it, unless there was some sort of big government subsidy in the circular economy space. But maybe it's something that a state government or a council would look at.
I'm interested. I picked up a piece of Scrimba. It was quite heavy. And is it structural? How?
It is structural. Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Look, it would be a substitute for pine framing or even LVL. You could actually make it in large sections.
Yep.
So, headers and beams and joists and bearers.
Thanks, Simon.
Amazing.
Yeah. Oh, look, and it was something that Australia had, and we gave it away.
Yeah. Great.
It was ahead of its time, and
as we usually do.
Yeah, as we do.
Simon, it probably needed a commercial person standing right next to the researcher, to be honest, at the same phase. So.
Well, there was $30 million was invested by Repco to develop the pilot plant,
right.
And it was probably 2 years premature, and it just didn't work like it was meant to work. And the properties they were getting were quite low, and the market just said, well, it's not as good as pine. Why would we want to buy it? things change. And I think, in today's age, if it's a little bit bigger, no one's really going to care, so long as it's the same price per linear metre.
And it's and if it's very stable.
It will be very stable. It will definitely have those properties.
Yeah. I think we've got to pull out all the stops here. Nothing's off the table, right? I mean,
look, absolutely.
It's a really interesting presentation, Simon. So glad you've come to put this up. But at the same point, it's depressing in some areas.
Never discount inertia in a market or perception and all that kind of stuff is unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly.
We're heading into a world where the circular economy is increasingly important, and it will be getting political and governmental support and maybe some funding. So the planets, life is always changing, and eventually the planets will align. And I think there will be a sweet spot sometime in the near future where these sort of products could become very relevant.
Yes.
100%. Okay, so anyhow, so the rubber wood. Or over time. The rubber wood particle board, again, great product. It'd be nice to see it actually get some legs. Now, the Holy Grail, one of the biggest challenges that the wood product sector has is getting rid of our treated wood waste. And that's dockings that have been, H3 or H2 treated for termites or fungi. You take particle board, for example. I think it's 10 or 20% of particle board sold in Australia is termite treated. Why can't we, or why don't we take treated dockings, basically turn those into particles and use that as feedstock for preservative treated particle board? You could actually completely displace existing chemicals, or you would actually take recovered treated wood out of landfill. So, your old fences and those type of things. And there is an absolute mountain of it. Vine posts. You all know what vine posts are for that the grapes grow on. There is roughly 2 million tonnes of stockpiled, discarded vine posts all over the country with no home to go to. Costs about $400 a tonne to dump it, which means that the grape growers just build a bigger stockpile that grows every year. So again, you could take materials like that and produce a really high quality treated product that is displacing virgin chemicals, as well as being fit for purpose and taking a potentially hazard waste out of the environment. And that, I think, is the end.